Hi and welcome back to the History of Russia podcast. This is episode 8, Kiev. Now before we get into today's subject, I just wanted to shout out to Peter K and MC for the great reviews on iTunes. As I say every week, thanks for taking the time out of your day to add a review to the iTunes page. Not only does it give me a warm feeling on the inside, but it also makes it easier for new listeners to find the show. Col on Twitter also pointed out that the iTunes algorithm for highlighting and charting shows is based off subscriptions too. So if you haven't already, could ask that you do that. Not only does it allow you to get the episodes as they're released, but again it makes it easier for others to find the show. Last week, whilst discussing Rorik and the beginnings of Novgorod, we neglected the happenings further south. At the same time, Rorik was setting up shop in the north. About 1100 kilometres to the south in Kiev, strangers from the north were also starting to have an impact in the region. For our American listeners, 1100 kilometres is 683 miles, or roughly the distance from Boston to Detroit. From my Western European upbringing at least, huge distance. I've posted a useful image on Twitter recently if you want to take a look to see just how far and how much territory there is in between the two cities. From their first, or at least first documented visit to Constantinople in 832, the Varangians, i.e. the traders and raiders located in modern-day Scandinavia, were able to, via both the Dnieper and Don rivers and their tributaries, sail from the Baltic to the Bosphorus. As a result, trade would become more prevalent throughout all of Europe. These were peoples that were beginning to become known throughout most of Europe as both traders and raiders. In the year 860, either by design or error, the Khazars, as we've discussed in a previous episode, with the aid of Byzantine engineers, built their famous fortress of Sarkel, aiming at not only being able to propel their military might, but also to control trade and commerce in the region. The side effect of this was it would also, and again I'm not sure if this was what the Khazars were aiming to do, but it would also cut off the Norse from being able to traverse the Don to get to the Black Sea, and subsequently on to Constantinople. Legend has it that this enraged the Rus, which was the nickname that the Byzantines, Khazars and Southern Slavs have now begun to call the men from the north, who, rather than direct their anger at the new fortress, would direct it to those that had given the tools and expertise to build it. They would sail for Constantinople and attempt to sack the city. Now, both Western and Eastern sources agree that this was a punitive expedition containing no more than 5,000 men and no more than 200 ships, which might sound a formidable number, but compared to Constantinople, while the city would have marketplaces and the suburbs that would have a greater number of people, it would barely be enough to encircle the seawalls, never mind do anything to restrict the land traffic. Again, the legends tell us, via the First Chronicle, that the expedition was led by two Rus warriors, one a man of a noble house, the other a peasant who had risen to fame due to his prowess in battle. They were named Askold and Deer. Olof von Dahlen, an 18th century Swedish historian amongst other things, tells us that Askold was actually Askold Bjornsson, a grandson of the mythical Ragnar Lodbrok, and Ad Stender Pettersson, a Danish historian born in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, concluded that Askold was actually a son of Halfdan rather than Bjorn, but all the same a grandson of Ragnar. Both originally accompanied Rorik on his expedition to Holmgard, before being commissioned to trade, raid and settle further south on the Dnieper. It's from here that they would integrate themselves into Kievan society, and similar to the themes of last week's episode, would be asked to be the leaders of this city. Kiev was not a new city. Excavations have shown a presence here since at least the 4th century AD, so just like last week, it's hard to imagine a scenario whereby two outsiders, two strangers, would be invited to take control and dictate affairs of the populace. What is possible, at least in my mind, is that due to the potential wealth traders on the Amber Road, again something that we've covered previously, that trading path from the Baltic to Mediterranean seas may have been able to accrue. This may have been able to give somebody serious political power. Anyhow, enough digressing, back to the siege of Constantinople. Well, it wasn't really a siege, as I alluded to beforehand, even though it's named as such in the history books. The host of 5,000 arrived, and not long after arriving, they promptly left. The church, at the time, put this down to a miracle, stating that an appearance of Mary in the sky above the city walls put fear into the hearts of the would-be attackers, who then promptly fled. Other contemporary sources say it was the quick reaction by the then Emperor Michael III that put flight to the invaders from the north. However, Alexander Vasiliev, the renowned historian who was described as the foremost authority on Byzantine history despite his name, paints a very different picture. In his excellent book, The Russian Attack on Constantinople in 860, and trust me, he's better at writing books than titling them, states that the Rus were no strangers to the area from extensive trade. They knew the strength of the city, and they knew its weaknesses well. Instead of attacking the city directly, they focused on the suburbs of the Isle of Princes in the Sea of Marmora. Knowing that many city officials, wealthy merchants, and even an exiled patriarch reside there at the time, outside of the safety of the Theodosian walls. They come upon the island in the dead of night, emitting no sound nor light, striking quickly and taking captives back to their boats and beyond the range of the safety of the Byzantine fleet, who could not put their Greek fire to use. The guard had been rotated, and the majority of the navy rerouted to Anatolia only days before. The Rus were as apt at espionage as they were at war. The picture he paints is less of one of a siege, but of kidnaps and ransoms. According to him, the men returned north after Michael paid ransoms for the captured citizens, but not after many had been brutally slain, and repatriations for the disruption to trade because of Circle. Once they had the gold, they returned north. This paints a very similar picture to what was happening in the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex at roughly the same point in history. If we follow the legend that Askell and Dare were Norse rulers at Kiev, it's hard not to imagine that such a successful outcome to a 5,000-man raid wouldn't have cemented the position of power in the city further. So, depending on what source you are inclined to believe, Kiev became a city ruled by a Rus elite class not long after Novgorod, or it would remain ruled by Slavs, at least for a little while longer. I won't give away my thoughts until next week, as the events we'll look at then, as we switch back up north and focus back on Novgorod, who are recently minus a king, will hopefully allow us to paint a better picture of what was happening south at the time. It might not make much sense at the moment, but I promise you it will after next week's episode. Now, despite being very much a legend, a marker of Askell's resting place was created in the 1930s in Kiev by the Soviet government as a park to celebrate the city's early history. It's actually still available to visit to this day and sits on the bank of the Dnieper River in central Kiev. This week, I had a couple of general questions come to me via email and Twitter, which rather than respond to individually, I thought it would be better to answer here. The first, from Chris with a K, asks how long does it take to research and record each episode? Well, typically, research takes around 5 hours a week, whilst recording and production is about 90 minutes at the moment, depending on the length of the episode. But this is getting quicker as I'm getting to grips with the technology, the software, and getting used to talking for so long. Next, David B from Spain asks about the pronunciation of certain cities, example Sevastopol, and why I pronounce it that way. Well, Sevastopol is pronounced that way in English. I appreciate that Russian Ukraine it's pronounced Sevastopol, but for the sake of clarity, and when we get to the likes of Moscow for ease of understanding, I'll be going with the English pronunciation of city and country names, otherwise it's going to get really confusing. Kaylee M asks about adverts. She says in a Twitter DM, given the number of downloads you have, as per the tweet you sent last night, shouldn't you be including adverts to pay for the source materials and hosting costs you must be incurring? Well, it's a fair question and it is something I've thought about, but I'm here to talk to you about history, not to try and sell you mattresses. It's something I think would really cheapen the show. Ultimately, I'm a listener of podcasts, and nothing grates my listening experience more than when the host or host try to segue in an advert that has no relation to their content. So it's not something that I'm really in a rush to push on to my listeners. Having said that, if the right offer came along, I'd definitely give it a thought. But it really has to add value to what I'm doing, i.e. if the Museum of X said we're doing an exhibit that's related to your content, here's a coupon code to give to listeners to give a discount on admission, then yeah, I'd be all over that, but it's not something I'm seeking out. Ultimately, this is my hobby, and I want it to remain a hobby. I think as soon as you start to monetize something, it feels too much like work. Anyhow, next week's episode will see us retain the Thursday release date due to having family staying with us, and in that episode we'll be going back north, at least for a little while, to see what's transpired in Novgorod upon Rurik's death, and how the cities of Novgorod's and Kiev's early histories are tied together. As usual, subscriptions on your podcasting app of choice and reviews on iTunes would be greatly appreciated. It really does allow the podcast to grow its user base, and it makes it easier for new users to find us. Feedback, as usual, can be sent to the historyofrussiapodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again. Ta-ra for now.